into power. It all seemed wildly unlikely to Felix himself, who barely knew any of the other members of his high cabinet and had never been allowed a private conversation with any of them. But Count Gerard von Hersendorf had not become the most powerful man in Astarion by dismissing any potential threats on the horizon. He had been preparing, even at the moment of his daughter's deeply disappointing death, for the worst that he could imagine to happen, and Felix had played directly into his hands with his unmanly display of emotion. The Count would never willingly give up the power he had seized 15 years ago. Having been appointed temporary regent by his fellow members of Astarion's High Cabinet, he had chosen to appoint himself chief minister on the day of Felix's 18th birthday, although he'd had the political sense to send out that proclamation in Felix's name. By then, Felix hadn't even tried to protest. He had been taught for years, by means of ruthless beatings, strategic isolation, and carefully calculated starvation, that the Count would brook no challenges to his authority, and Count von Herzendorf recognized no mercy when it came to enforcing his will. The laws of the Empire and the force of public opinion were both strong enough that he couldn't push Felix over the balcony now, in front of hundreds of fascinated onlookers. However, he could make utterly certain that no one would be surprised when news of the Archduke's eventual, tragically self-inflicted death was finally released to the newspapers. Felix had no doubt that all the details of that upcoming death had already been carefully planned. He'd learned when he was young that the only way to survive and ensure Emmeline's safety was to bury himself in the dreamy world of books and poetry and leave every higher decision to the Count's authority. But as Felix looked across the sea of glittering opera glasses now, an astonishing realization suddenly formed within him. Those old flames of rebellion, which he'd thought so thoroughly quashed years ago, popped up a few last burning embers after all. He had nothing left to lose. Emmeline was gone. There was no one else he cared for. Count von Herzendorf had taken the utmost care to manage that state of affairs by keeping a steady flow of new servants in regular rotation. In other words, no one Felix loved could possibly be hurt by his actions anymore. The shining liberation of that realization lifted him up out of his cushioned seat and all the way to his feet. As the entire audience gasped with shock at his first-ever public breach of protocol, he opened his mouth and drew a deep breath to speak every damning truth at the top of his lungs for everyone to hear and every newspaper to report across the continent. Just as his brother-in-law's steel-toed military boot, hidden from the rest of the audience by the low, swag-draped wall of the opera box, swept out to slam into the back of his knee, sending Felix toppling back into his seat with an undignified, yelping crash. "The Archduke is ill," the High General bellowed, pressing one large hand firmly against Felix's chest to hold him down. "Close the curtains." Uniformed footmen leaped forward to untie the silk ropes that held thick crimson curtains open around their box. "No," Felix gritted, pushing against his brother-in-law's grip. "Wait, The curtains fell closed around them as a roar of sound filled the rest of the theater, the audience losing all interest in the drama on stage. There was no chance of being heard outside the royal box anymore. "What the devil do you think you're playing at?" His brother-in-law, Radomir, shifted his grip to a hard clamp on Felix's closest wrist to keep him safely pinned. "Thinking of taking up a singing career, little brother? I wouldn't try it with your voice." "Enough of this nonsense," snapped Felix's father-in-law, glowering over his mustache. "We'll have a physician summoned to the box, then bundle him home before he can cause any more trouble. You and I will stay here so no one goes into hysterics. In the meantime..." Ignoring Felix, as usual whenever politics came up, the Count held up a letter that had been discreetly passed to him by a servant during the opera's first act. "What's all this nonsense about surrender to the Witch of the East? Do you have any idea how many hundreds of guilder we've sent her uncle over the years to keep those cursed mountains under our control? Damn it. Kidvaria's directly on our border. We can't let her little uprising win." "Sorry, I called back our final troops this morning, at least the 100 that survived." Radomir shrugged. "I was planning to tell you after tonight's performance. There's no use wasting money on any more attempts at taking back that kingdom for her uncle."